welcome everybody. I'm here with Kushti, Alex Chepurnoy, to talk about Ergo as the future of proof of work and looking at kind of the cross-chain view and let's say future that we're working towards with a lot of the side chain thinking, planning, research that we've been doing. So how are you today, Alex?
My pleasure to be here again. And so this is another part of presentations, with the aim to revitalize proof of work landscape.
Yeah.
So, it's already around for 15 years, right? And so it's time to look back, analyze where we now and what we are doing at this point, and then think about building future of proof of work.
Yeah, I remember back in like the color coin days where people were, excited that, hey, we're gonna have different like tokens that represent, real world assets built on top of proof of work, but never really went anywhere. It seemed incomplete. I think a lot of like logic was missing. It was simple.
Yeah, actually, the same is true for many applications. Intended for Bitcoin, like crowdfunding. That was Lighthouse startup back in 2014. Then what Colo, which started with using colored coins for some community currency systems and so on. So yeah, actually, I spend a lot of time analyzing why they failed and how to make proof of work UTX or cryptocurrency useful, right? And so now, in 2024, we need for a comprehensive vision, right? And we can do a lot of things better now.
Yeah.
And unlike Bitcoin launch, so there is no point in launching proof of work cryptocurrencies without programmability these days, right? But still, the industry is doing that heavily by launching, mostly short living proof of work coins, right? Which is unfortunate. And in most cases, I believe they are short living because there are no applications, right? So, there are only some marketing promises, right?
Yeah, you can send it, you can receive it, you can hold it. And that's, the bottom line is in terms of like creating business logic, creating derivatives, creating I don't know, advanced frameworks. It's just never gonna go anywhere. And even in Bitcoin, we still see like, oh, we're gonna, have some layer two that it's what, just like multi-sig based usually, or I don't even know.
Right. So, it's pretty sad because, digital commodities, proof of cryptocurrencies, I believe, is the best collateral for DeFi applications, right? Due to the nature of proof of work mining.
Yeah, I tend to fully be with you on that. It's underappreciated, I really think it's going to be interesting to see, like, there's been a narrative for, I don't know, let's say probably a decade in the US where there's been a big focus on like green, right? And a lot of investment groups are starting to pivot towards like this AI idea. And, then you get into data centers, heavy computational resource costs. And, in a way, it's going to be interesting to watch the narrative pivot back in a way more towards like proof of work, where it's like, okay, yeah, we are burning, a lot of energy, we are using a lot of computational power, but then what are we creating with that? right? That's ultimately what matters. Um, who knows? Maybe, as like that type of infrastructure scales, because I'm sure there's a lot of companies that are throwing a lot of money to build out hardware and build data centers. As failed startups are going to be great for proof of work if they have nice GPU infrastructure or, uh, let's see.
Yeah, and well, actually, proof of work is potentially useful to reduce waste, right? Because usually, well, it makes sense to mine where there is excess in supply of energy, right?
Mhm.
When energy is often lost, right? Like in case of excessive hydro power or flare gas or whatever. Right. So usually, if mining is successful, right, competitive on global scale, that means that electricity is cheap, right, very cheap, and that means it's often lost otherwise, right? And
Mhm.
then, yeah, well, proof of work is actually a very interesting mechanism, right, to store energy, otherwise would be lost in value directly, right? And then maybe even buy electricity in other places, right, with proof of work cryptocurrencies. That's a very interesting kind of energy arbitrage through proof for cryptocurrencies.
The the truth is that's probably one of the larger questions that humanity has to address as it scales, is the energy needs of civilization, right? And it's interesting to look at how proof of work is most profitable with waste, right? Whether even like in GPU mining, how many of our miners are, taking old cards and they're like, okay, well, let's, rethermal paste them or let's add some new components if something is, not working as intended. And, they're giving like a second life to e-waste. And, hopefully if they have a good jurisdiction for power cost, it's like there's reducing waste on both sides by creating some efficient form of money.
Right, yeah, and the same is true for CPU mining because yeah, in many cases, so it's about well data centers reusing old CPUs
Mhm.
uh, that they cannot plug into servers anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, and well, proof of work cryptocurrency is also kind of hard money, right? So that they created with electricity. They're not appearing out of nowhere in this regard, and that's why we do love them, right? And then yeah, it also means that's yeah, it's the best kind of collateral for DeFi applications, right? Because well, it's not printed like some tokens,
Well,
right?
you get into this idea of seniorage, right? The cost of producing money versus like the value of it. And with a lot of systems, like if you look at seed rounds and kind of how they came into existence and who controls the majority of the monetary creation and emission, there's massive seniorage, but in terms of like the cost of production of money versus the value of money. And long term, that gap tends to trend towards a balance.
Mm. And yeah, and so well, yeah, coming from the real world via burning the electricity. So proof of work cryptocurrencies do need for the real world, right? So there is a need for collateral in many places around the globe to do monetary expansion. right? To create new assets without trust, such as algorithmic stable coins and so on, to do DeFi applications, right? To bank the unbanked for real, right, and so on. And that's the reason why proof of work commodities should be programmable.
Yeah.
But also, what can we do better these days is to have better and unified cross-chaining between different proof of work tests, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now it's interesting how probably the only system that does a really good job of that, well, let's call it compatibility, is EVM, right? But EVM, has shifted away from proof of work, pretty aggressively to, if you look at basically every system or roll up, you're gonna not really see proof of work involved anymore. Um, But looking at that compatible logic, that's, fascinating to me to say, okay, well, we've spent how many years developing Sigma, and essentially this whole suite, whether it's stable coins, lending, is open source, and a part of the power of open source software is compatibility, right? Because it's free and it's without license, we could, potentially plug it into multiple environments and connect them together to where I guess if you're looking at like a constellation of sigma chains, the net idea is to capture energy, right? And at that point, it doesn't matter if it's an ASIC, it shouldn't matter if it's a GPU, it shouldn't matter if it's a CPU. And even if it's ASIC or a GPU or CPU, I don't think it necessarily even matters the algorithm, right? Uh, the net goal should simply be to capture energy and allow people to direct and convert their, energy and computational power into some compatible broad network of, let's say, proof of work systems.
Indeed. So, I agree that EVM is kind of common layer these days, right? So, there are now tens of projects, right, which are just using EVM and then changing consensus. In most cases, those changes are controversial, right, in comparison with the original, even with Ethereum's proof of stake. And then, by doing that, they're doing a kind of monetary expansion, right? And they're creating, collateral for DeFi in form of their tokens, Avalanche tokens, Polygon, and so on, Binance Smart Chain. Right, and for a new EVM chain, there is already a lot of D apps, right, to fork, or in many cases, so popular D apps on Ethereum launching new deployments by themselves. And there is no alternative in proof of work world, right? Unfortunately, but proof of work cryptocurrencies are better collateral, I believe. So, the whole supply is not appearing out of nowhere, right? It's not going immediately to choosing views and so on. You need to burn electricity, right, to get proof of work cryptocurrencies, and that's why it's better collateral, but then upper layers, are missed.
But no, it's
So,
true. Proof of work coins, in order to be created, require collateral in the real world. They require hardware, they require energy. Versus, if you look at systems where, you kind of have this, we're going to pre-mint, pre-distribute, and then go through an unlocking mechanism for a period of time. Um, it's like they gained from a network effect that they're creating versus like an external collateral.
Right. So if we can imagine, so universe of sigma chains with dApps already since day one, which is already quite interesting story, right? Because I can't remember any programmable proof of work blockchain with ready-made applications, right? Since the day one. And then, also imagine cross-chain capabilities, right? So trustless pegging between Sigma chains. And that's, ahead of EVM chains, right? So, in case of EVM, that's kind of fragmented, right, ecosystem if we are talking about different chains, right? And here we can do better even, right? Then we have different base layer, so proof of work, and then with programmability, it's getting on par with EVM constellation, but then it's not fragmented, right? So with trustless cross-chaining. So
Yeah.
that's the better story,
But
actually.
it's interesting to look at like how all of these different layer twos in the EVM verse are going to compete for liquidity. And then it's like, okay, is it going to be like another DeFi summer where you just have silly money printing to incentivize liquidity, and then it has a kind of a short burn, and somebody else comes in and offers better incentives and money printing, and then we see a short burn, and we kind of see this rotation? Or is it going to be more regulatory capture, I guess, is a potential with like Base, where they're KYCing everybody and trying to say it's an exchange, but it's also the roll up. And I don't know, that's interesting to watch.
With centralized control, our cross-chaining, right? We see a lot of interesting, or actually not so interesting, dramas these days. Old but not good centralized show, and so on. So and in regards with layer one tokens, right? Also, a lot of tricky games to create value, right? Via airdrops and so on. A lot of marketing,
Really?
sometimes selling snake oil, basically. But in proof of work setting, so you naturally have collateral being appearing right naturally and not for free. So you need to buy it with electricity after all.
Yeah, and you get a distributed network of people that are contributing power and energy to that kind of hash rate wall that acts as the security of the network. And that's always cool too, because I guess with some of these systems, you can say who's the validator, right? Like who's actually running this system? Is everybody just using a light wallet and connecting to some server somewhere? And how does that work in terms of like resilience, censorship resistance, and a lot of these ideas that kind of were born from proof of work, and I cannot say have improved as newer models have come around.
Right. And after all, there are some economic consequences, right, coming with censorship and so on. So, after all, a lot of possible legal as well as economic consequences, right, for having this unfortunate degradation in regards with decentralization and so on. Right. So yeah. Well. And now let's go to the trustless cross-chain, right? So well, the part where we can do better than even chains, and actually better than Polkadot, Cosmos, and so on, I believe, because well, I've checked well the protocols recently, and it seems there is no any progress in 5 or 6 years, so no any security analysis, so just some hand-wavy protocols. Well, there is needs to do better, right? And well, now also cross-chain could be more flexible, right? And in particular, it can cover different kinds of consensus mechanisms. So we can have efficient cross-chaining for different settings, such as matched mind sidechains,
Mhm.
right? Where Ergo miners are also mining some sidechains, maybe with some experimental features,
You know,
right?
I've always thought that merged mind sidechains probably make more sense for like scaling applications than layer twos.
Yeah, so in many cases, they're simpler than other layer 2 solutions, right? And yeah, well, with efficient and trustless cross-chaining, so yeah, well, merged mind sidechains is a natural choice for scaling applications, right, on top of Ergo.
Mhm.
Then we can have other options. So we can imagine more experimentation in matched mining. So, for example, what I'm thinking about is so-called, I'm calling it double matched mine sidechains. When
Mhm.
some blocks are matched mined with Bitcoin and others with Ergo, for example. Right, and also we can have Sigma chains with delegated mining, so with some ASIC-friendly mining, SHA-256, even ETH hash,
Yeah.
K hash, Blake 3, what else? Maybe CPU mining,
Mhm.
right? Random X and so on.
Maybe GPU algos too. I mean, why not? If the net goal there is just to sink energy into a common compatible constellation of chains, the energy input function shouldn't really matter, you know?
Yeah, maybe yeah, for GPU mining, because well, different GPUs uh,
Yeah.
well naturally target different mining algorithms, right?
Uh-huh.
So for example, well, in 1 year, even less, so well, Ergo could be not so attractive to 4 GB cards, right? And then, yeah, for such cards, there could be some separate Sigma chain with, well, some dedicated
Yeah, dedicated
mining
to
for,
cards.
for old GPUs.
I know I've had some AMDs that were mining out of Lycos and their efficiency sucked versus the NVIDIA cards, but is what it is. It's what I had, right?
Yeah, and well, with time, so efficiency is also changing, right? Because, well, the memory table size is increasing, and that means that yeah, well, GPUs which are efficient now could be not so efficient well, in years, right, and vice versa.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Then I
and
guess
so well, sorry, yeah.
I was just going to say, I guess another, consideration there long term is just going to be how hardware is going to change long term. Like that's its own.
Uh,
That,
yeah, that's not predictable even, right? So no one
uh,
knows
I mean,
about
if I had
hardware.
to put on a tinfoil hat, I'd say maybe in a decade, we'll have FPGAs and we'll have like AI programs that just flash them for whatever's the most efficient. I have no idea. Who knows?
Yeah, hard to say, hard to say. And so yeah, well, FPGAs, GPUs, so they're making very quick progress these days.
Yeah.
So for example, in ITO Lycos 2, other Ergos mining algorithm. So well, maximum table size is limited to about 64 gig. And well, there were some questions back then. So back in 2020, isn't that too much? But now in 2024, so we already have such cards, right? And so when these limits will be reached, so probably like most of cards would be 64 gig or more, maybe 128 or even 256. So then, yeah, it's hard to predict anything, right, in regards with hardware evolution.
No, but I think it's interesting to have a broad hardware, let's say, competition in a way, where it's like, okay, if compute is a resource and, based on how, certain, I don't know, learning machine frameworks, etc., are popularized and potentially adopted, it'll be interesting to see how different types of proof of work like fit into the demand for hardware, right?
Right.
And then, it's like, could you even use some type of proof of work to like balance peak demand in terms of like learning machine setups where, you've invested millions to build this huge data center, and if you don't have the data traffic at full capacity, why not reuse some of your hardware and mine, right? Rather than just, perhaps have them sit there semi-idle. I don't know. It's interesting to think about long term.
Yeah. So concluding, there are different Sigma chain options, right? So matched minds, well, double matched minds, and well, I believe there could be more options here, and also, well, we can have Sigma chains with dedicated mining, harnessing work of different kind.
Yeah,
Right. So, yeah.
if it's Sigma compatible, I don't think it'd take us much time at all to plug Rosen on top of it. And then you have kind of a external, at least connection through that network to everything that Rosen is connected and will be connected to. So, it'd be interesting to say, okay, if you could launch Ergo today, versus when we started, and you had the ability to bridge into multiple ecosystems and you could launch on Uniswap in places with a lot of liquidity instead of mine and start with, you know, Tidex and Hotbit and, like tiny little isolated markets, how much quicker could you potentially build the security subsidy for that proof of work?
Right, but also, well, in addition to ROSM, so well, federated bridges and other applications. So you have trustless pegging, right? Also, since the day one,
Yeah.
which I believe is also quite a big story. And so, well, we have different sidechain constructions for different settings mentioned. So, well, for merged mined sidechains, unsurprisingly, we can have trustless two-way pegging because, well, in Sigma, well, also known as Ergo tree, so well, Ergo's contractual layer. There is possibility to have different types of data, right? Well, including headers and so on. And it's possible to read sidechain data written on the blockchain, right, efficiently, well, including commitments to sidechain UTXO set. Right, unlike Bitcoin, where you cannot use Merkle tree of sidechain block transactions, right, in contracts. So, Bitcoin contracts are very limited here, but in case of Ergo, so you can use sidechains UTXO set in contracts. And then you can have, pagan security basically the same as matched mind sidechains consensus security. So, pagan security is basically reduced to just sidechain consensus. And then, it's covered in another quite lengthy presentation I made during the post-hackathon Ergo Summit a few months ago.
So what about double merged mine side chains?
It's still quite exotic setting. So I haven't seen such idea even around, and still more investigation needed. But I believe it can be used for bridging Ergo with other proof of work blockchains and minimizing trust on the way in comparison with other options, and also enriching Bitcoin and other contractually limited blockchains. So, for example, there was RGB proposal from Nervous blockchain recently, where you can basically write RGB data not into off-chain storage, but on Nervous blockchain. But here you can do a bit similar thing to enrich Bitcoin with contracts, right? So, for example, you can imagine a Sigma chain, which is also Bitcoin sidechain, right? But unlike other sidechains we have now, where you have just Merkle tree roots of sidechain block transactions written on the Bitcoin blockchain. So you may have Bitcoin even as well as sidechain UTXO set commitments written. Right, and then you can use Bitcoin UTXO set basically in sidechain contracts, right? And you can do maybe things a bit similar to RGB, so executing some rich applications right out of Bitcoin blockchain, but with Bitcoin transactions submitted on the Bitcoin blockchain, but also with auxiliary transactions submitted on the sidechain, right? So instead of off-chain, so now you have sidechain security, right, in matched mind setting. And you also can imagine double matched mining. Bitcoin and Ergo UTXO sets coexisting on the same blockchain, right, where some blocks are matched mined with Bitcoin, other blocks with Ergo, and then possibility to do some things such as Maybe bridges with less trust, right? With matched mind trust between Bitcoin and Ergo. So this is very interesting setting, right? To be investigated.
Yeah. Well, I like
All
building
right, and
on top of miners.
then yeah, with dedicated mining, yeah, you can have also pretty trustless sidechaining with relay contracts, right? So we just need to add autolycos 2 verification, which is actually requested by some applications on Ergo blockchain as well, such as Lithos, right? So will be included in the Sigma 6.0 anyway. And well, with relay contracts, you can have SPV clients done as on-chain contracts on sidechain. And then, with such relays, yeah, we can have main chain data to be available, main chain data to be available on sidechain, right? But then also sidechain can actually demand and can reward main chain miners for submitting sidechain data on the main chain, right? Which is an alternative to BAP 301, I believe, but now, well, with much more clear incentive mechanism, right? So basically, Ergo miners can just submit sidechain data, even avoiding validating data, so that they can just run SPV clients for sidechains, right, to avoid verification. The main concern for BAP 301. They can just submit SPV data, right, for different side chains, and for that they are getting rewarded with sidechain tokens, right,
Mhm.
via kind of emission contract. Kind of well-established thing in the Sigma world, right? Then it's about improved security for Ergo network, and this also about more clear, crypto economic, let's say, security for
Incentive.
pegging back, right, from sidechain to main chain. It's trust minimized, and I believe in practice probably the best solution, right, for sidechain.
Mhm. Well, it creates a unique hub where you have this constellation of chains that can be built around Ergo that can potentially incentivize Ergo miners potentially. You have this idea where you create compatibility. Perhaps we kind of rehash what we did with Ergo, where we have a development perhaps market fund that miners send via some emission. Again, nothing structured, but it's open, and we could definitely advance kind of the idea of Ergo Tree and proof of work, which I think are kind of a beautiful combination.
Yeah, and then with time we can investigate other options. So, for example, to have zero knowledge, trustless zero knowledge, such as bulletproofs based relays
Mhm.
on the main chain. But that's way too early to consider
Yeah,
this
get
seriously
something
at
with
this
close to
point.
quantum signatures that is a lifeboat just in case, right?
That could be an option for a merged mind sidechain, right? So, proof of work is secure in the presence of quantum adversaries. But then, yeah, well, you can consider some Exodus sidechain, right, with post-quantum signatures. And yeah, well, also Sigma chains with dedicated mining and with this crypto economic security is actually well secure in the presence of quantum adversaries, and bulletproofs are not bulletproof based relay contracts. So then yeah, no, well, so this well crypto economic option is then secure even against quantum adversaries, right? When yeah, we will have bigger problems with signatures and so on.
Fun, fun.
Right, and so well, we are talking about constellation, right, and so on, and well, with those cross-chaining options discussed, so we can think about the future of Ergo as of Ergo being a hub, right, for well multi-chain proof of work future.
Mhm.
So, and in certain aspects similar to Cosmos or Polkadot, but yeah, well, more flexible in this regard because, well, it's not in the core, right? Not in the consensus layer. So everything is on the application level. So, well, all the cross-chain solutions presented are about just well being on the application level, right? As
Mhm.
well, Ergo tree, Ergo script contracts.
Yeah, and I guess we could also take a step back and say, okay, well, aside from, potentially, I'll call them higher quality assets because they're created with energy as collateral. The potential to create improved security incentive for miners in different uh, Sigma chains. Then we can also look at this idea of compatibility in terms of layer two solutions across Sigma chains, which is another interesting thing to consider. If you could plug chain cache on top of multiple chains of the constellation, that would be quite fascinating to see how that would, potentially accelerate the development of that.
All right. Yeah. So there are a lot of consequences, right? So when you have different Sigma chains with DeFi batteries since day one, with DEXs, bridges, and
DeFi
yeah,
shit.
also to trustless cross chaining. Right, that means so you have more collateral in Ergo DeFi, right, as well as Ergo and other proof of work assets being immediately used on a new blockchain since day one, which means yeah, lots of interesting possibilities, right, especially for newly launched blockchains. So when supply is limited, right, in early days, but you already have a lot of demand, and so supply could be immediately consumed on the Ergo blockchain,
Mhm.
and so on, and also, well, with yeah, the DeFi batteries, we can experiment with emission contracts, right, for new blockchains. So we may, for example, lock something in LP pools, so some amount of tokens with LP tokens being burned, for example, right? We can do the same with stable coins, for example, and so on.
Yeah.
All right, so you can have some DeFi being actually pre-built even before Genesis block, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of ways you could structure emission contracts that are interesting. You could offset halvings on Bitcoin if you had a SHA-256 Sigma chain to where it's like when miner profitability for the main chain, takes a dive, potentially there's a place to migrate to, right? Because miners want to mine. I mean, they need to if they've invested significant resource in terms of, their facility, their hardware, their energy costs, more or less, they need to mine. And so, obviously, I think providing alternative options with simply, better programmability is going to be something that, okay, some purists will probably, scoff at, but the miners want to mine.
Yeah. And so we can have different interesting outcomes on different levels, right? So yeah, we will have different sidechains for different classes of mining devices, as you mentioned, right? And yeah, the work will be definitely useful since day one, right? So no need to launch useless forks of another useless cryptocurrencies with no programmability, right? Well, that does not make sense since we are in 2024, right?
It's
We
kind of
can
sad
imagine
to
better.
see, proof of work to some degree has gotten to like the spec mining more than, like in terms of like the long term, I don't know, feasibility. I would say sometimes it's quite questionable.
And yeah, and then for chain cache uh, and probably other frameworks as well. I don't know. Maybe we will see some stablecoin frameworks utilizing different proof of work assets
I hope
under
so. I
the
hope so.
same hood.
I think long term, like when you get into this idea of using proof of work coins as collateral, having I don't know, you could say, okay, if each chain had a stable coin, you could create a basket of stable coins, or like you can create just more exotic products, more exotic derivatives. It's interesting, multi
Yeah,
collateralized.
and yeah, and for chain cache, it would be natural, right? So natural to use. Yeah, all the sigma chains possible, right? To everywhere. So to tame all the proof of work assets, right? And then so to have flexibility in regards with base money, right? Proof of work commodity provided to chain cache work. And then, yeah, there is another uh, possibility to expand, right, on the upper layers on top of the base money. So you can do monetary expansion via, combining trust and collateral. Right. So, yeah, possibilities here seem to be endless.
I
So
think,
yeah,
I think
I'm
that,
actually quite excited about having this comprehensive vision after uh, many years
yeah.
of thinking about
No,
and
me too. Me too. This
working.
has been like I don't know, something I've been chewing on for a long time. Like how do you create, real world collateral to create digital money, with clear assumptions, and if you can have multiple hardware inputs, it'll be broader based if it's compatible. And then if on top of it you can create, a unique, partially reserved systems, or, potentially even no reserve systems that people can voluntarily agree and interact with. Fascinating. It's just a better dynamic of creating money as a whole, and it still has different layers of flexibility on different levels. So let's do it. It might take what,
Yeah,
a
and
while.
so it's going it's going from the real world, right? Via electricity being burned, and then after many loops, right, going back to the real world, right, by creating money, right, with elastic supply on top of electricity being burned before, with digital and trust minimized, trustless ledgers being used on the way, and so on. Yeah, so quite fascinating, and that's cryptocurrencies. Finally, being useful, right, for the real world.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where I can't say 2 weeks. Let's say what, 2 years before we have a full. That's gonna be a
I,
heavy,
uh,
heavy lift, but that'll be fun.
yeah, so I don't know. That's pretty ambitious, right? Vision, but why not? So, the space is already around for 15 years, right? So, then, yeah, another 2 years is not actually
No,
that long period.
no. But I definitely I like the direction of that. You know, it's interesting.
But also it's not a single project, right? So a lot of bricks here which are just building on top of each other. So some results would be visible almost immediately, right? So it's possible to get some parts of equation in work without the whole picture to be realized. But it's always good to have in mind the whole picture, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think even if we had one Sigma chain that had a different, hardware base as energy input, and it kind of acts as the, I don't know, a pioneer chain to like prove the viability of that and it's kind of build like the base. If it works there, you can scale across hardware classes, uh, you know, and I guess you also have this really interesting concept long term where it's like the ability to asynchronously potentially update via softworks, right? So, if there's something over here
Right.
pulled into another environment, it just creates like a hardness around Ergo tree or Sigma, the language.
Right. And yeah, and also possibility to experiment with different new features via sidechains, right? So, for example, we can try to use some bulletproof circuits as Sigma protocols, right?
Mhm.
Because they're Sigma protocols after all, and so on. So, yeah, a lot of possibilities. Yeah, so for the main chain, right? As it's already established story with application with certain market capitalization and on. So maybe it's better not to do wild experiments, right? So
No, I've
yeah,
always
it's
thought that was silly.
to do them on some side chains, for example, merged mind once, right, and then with trustless pegging, so you can do experiments without risking so much, but still, yeah, without also risking the main chain.
Yeah, I've ran into that question so many times on the AMA. It's like, when proof of use will work, and I'm just like, are you serious? You want us to just like rebuild everything on a untested foundation immediately because it sounds sexy? Get out of here. But as a sidechain,
Yeah, so yeah, when you're breaking everything, because there is some new trends, right, a period for 2 months.
yeah,
Yeah, probably never, hopefully. All right, but yeah, still, it would be good to have some possibility for having
playgrounds.
playgrounds, right? So minimized uh, plugin security assumptions.
So with the
All right. Anything else
yeah,
to
yeah, I
talk
want to I
about?
want to circle back to the developer DAO that you've uh, started forming on the Ergo forum. You've kind of put out a lot of these ideas in a rough form. It seems maybe a little fragmented. Probably part of why we're doing these videos to help. But somebody wants to contribute, what do they do?
Yeah, so we have already well, like 7 or 8 people, which is quite good. So yeah, I'm already managing them, right, with different tasks like doing EAPs management properly, right, and Ergo core development and Sigma and so on. So, now there is also a public chain cache group established. I'm inviting some Rust developers. And yeah, so there are some first money received, right? So I'm establishing multi-sig wallet for managing funds. And yeah, so a lot of work to do here as well, but yeah, well, it's going pretty well. And so I'm also thinking to propose to do some side chaining support work, right, at the devs DAO.
Absolutely. All right, my friend. I think it was a good talk. I don't know how long this has been running, but I think it's going to be a lot for people.
Pretty long already. So yeah, let's conclude. So concluding, we have vision for none less than future of proof of work, right? And we still I believe that there is future, and even more there is a bright future for proof of work.
Yeah, I have to agree. It's definitely a big idea. But considering the state of the space and a lot of things really are not that much better than, color coins back when I first started mining. I'm definitely excited to push this forward. And yeah, I think that's I don't know, it's a big step for this idea of unstoppable digital money built on top of proof of work. So I'm excited. I'm going to be here for it for a while.
All right. Yeah. So that sounds exciting, uh, even to me. So yeah. Well, with that, thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Uh,
If you want
have
to
a good
discuss anything, you can always hop into the Telegram or on Twitter or whatever. Ergo community usually is pretty easy to reach out, work with. So have a good one.
Yeah, and in case of interest, please check auxiliary materials. So chain cache presentations. There are 2 presentations, and merged mind side chains presentation. And yeah, let's continue our the Ergo forum, Discord, Telegram, and so on. And have a good day, everyone. Bye.
All right.